morning, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I am your host, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode 249. Show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/249. In this episode, we're going to be trying to figure out what exactly the U.S. policy is in regard to Taiwan. How does the United States view Taiwan diplomatically and officially? What is the U.S. policy towards Taiwan? Does the United States see Taiwan as being its own sovereign nation? Does the United States instead see Taiwan as being part of China itself? Or is the official U.S. Taiwan policy something that's a bit more subject to argument and a bit ambiguous, maybe purposefully so? And what is that purpose? So in this episode, we're going to be touching on kind of starting the discussion off by talking about the myth of the rule of law, which is an article, a Wisconsin Law Review article written by John Hasness. And you can see here on screen, it's a chapter in Anarchy in the Law, edited by Edward Stringham. And this is something I've talked about with Keith Knight before. Basically, this idea that there is no such thing as an objective law, is that reasonable people can have two competing arguments about something that are both correct in their own way, and there's no objectively correct answer. You could use different arguments and different precedent and come to different results. That's partly why the Constitution has been so eroded over the years, is because you could come up, really smart people who went to Harvard and Yale mostly, who put on black robes, can fashion any kind of argument that they want. And that's why, I'm alluding to the Supreme Court, but that's why the Supreme Court and appellate courts issue something called an opinion. Because if you have a wrinkle in the law or something like that, there's not always an objectively correct answer. Sometimes there are, but a lot of times there are not. So you could have, I think John Hasness uses an example from Supreme Court opinions itself. But one example is you have two sides to a contract and something breaks in the contract. There's a breach and one party moves for damages. And attorneys from both sides will support why the contract shouldn't be enforced, or the other side will argue why the contract shouldn't be enforced. Or did I repeat that? One will argue the contract should be enforced and the other will argue that the contract should not be enforced. And they'll back up their arguments with precedent, case law, arguments from the facts, arguments from depositions or court proceedings or things like that. And at the end of the day, both sides might be very well supported in their argumentation. But at the end of the day, the court has to pick one winner. It can't pick both to be winners. Or it could try, I suppose, to split the baby. But at the end of the day, there's an answer that needs to come out and a solution that needs to be had. And if these professors, the justices, they issue an opinion, and that is just an opinion, other justices on the same bench, on the same court, might not agree. That's why there's dissenting opinions. But as long as there's a majority, that will carry the actual ruling of the court. And the issue of Taiwan and what the actual status is of Taiwan is very much kind of the same issue, because you have essentially what amounts to a contract between two parties. Now, I'm not versed in international law, and so as a trained attorney, when I look at these things, I try to look at, okay, well, first off, what is a contract? It's a promise or a set of promises for the breach of which the law has a remedy. So it's a promise or a set of promises that if broken, the law will enforce those promises. Obligated promises. A contract is voluntarily entered into. So it's bargain and acceptance and basically something called consideration, which is really way beyond the scope of this episode. So going back to Taiwan, why did I want to make this episode in the first place? The truth is kind of embarrassing in a way, because on March 1st, I opened my big fat mouth on Twitter and I commented on something that the LP Georgia was tweeting that essentially Taiwan is China. And that's something that they could say. It's an opinion that you could have, but I took a more aggressive approach to it. And I said, basically, it's official US policy that Taiwan is China. And I kind of elaborated on it because people were kind of being really pissed off about it and arguing with me about it. And I think we're going to get into this, of course. That's the whole point of this episode. But I really think that in my elaboration, I got some things wrong. But in the actual statement that Taiwan is part of China, I think I'm correct. Because, spoiler alert, this subject of what is the official US policy on Taiwan, there's no correct answer, really. Some people will say there's a correct answer, and maybe I went too far in saying that there is a correct answer. I can make a good argument from the text that is the case, that official US policy has to be that Taiwan is part of China, and that China rules over Taiwan, and that China is sovereign over Taiwan. When I say China, I mean the People's Republic of China, the one ruled by the Communist Party, the CCP. And, of course, people they point to a whole lot of things that we're going to get into and say, okay, well, there's a difference between, and this is going to be a really confusing episode, so you might have to re-listen to it. But people who were arguing against me was saying, no, Patrick, they would say Patty. They call me Patty in a condescending way, like I'm some kind of child or something. They would say, no, you're confusing the one China policy with the one China principle, where the one China policy is the United States policy of saying that there is one China. And the one China principle is the PCR's or the PRC's take, the Chinese communist take, that there is one China, that Taiwan is part of China, and that China has sovereignty over Taiwan. That being the difference. And so this is going to get really, the whole point of this episode is to make sure that you're familiar with the governing documents here, and that you're familiar with the arguments, and that you can make up your own mind. I think my position is well supported, but we're going to get into that. Now, I was saying before about contract laws that I'm not versed in international law, but when I take a look at this, I view these pledges, because that's what they are the joint communiques issued in 1972, 1979, and I think 1982, and the 6 assurances given to Taiwan. And I view that, because they were issued by the United States to China, as being some kind of a contract, if you will. Now, maybe it's not exactly as strict, like international law isn't as strict as U.S. courts would be in interpreting contracts. And maybe there aren't mutual promises being made or pledge. Maybe there aren't mutual pledges here, so maybe the contract analogy doesn't exactly fit. But I think it's illustrative of what the U.S. policy actually is. And the first thing that we would go to when we try to determine what U.S. policy, official U.S. policy is that we would take a look at the actual documents that brought forth that policy. I think that's a reasonable place to look first, and to try to discern from the plain language of the text what exactly the U.S. policy is. So that being said, first I'm going to turn to something that was cited at me, which was this interview with Rex Tillerson. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of State. Of course, this was published. This article and interview was published in 2017, but I think it was posted on the Center for Strategic and International Studies website, which is kind of a very blobby type organization. So here's the, I'll call this the establishment view, right? So the first question to Rex Tillerson was, what is the U.S. one China policy and why does it exist? Now, remember, the one China policy is the U.S. policy, not to be confused with the one China principle, which is the Chinese position. So Tillerson says, when the United States moved to recognize the PRC and de-recognize the Republic of China in 1979. So remember that the Republic of China was the government of Chiang Kai-shek during the Chinese Civil Wars. That the Kuomintang, the political party that was at war with the Chinese communists when the Chinese communism came to be. The Kuomintang waged a civil war against the communists on the mainland, and the Kuomintang was defeated, and they retreated and occupied Taiwan, and they called themselves the Republic of China as opposed to the People's Republic of China. And for a long time, it was, the government in exile, if you will, the Republic of China, claimed to be the legitimate government of Taiwan and mainland China, even though they were resigned to Taiwan. And the PRC, of course, claimed sovereignty over China and Taiwan as well. So up until 1979, the United States had recognized Taiwan as being its own sovereign entity. The United States recognized Taiwan before 1979 as being the government of Taiwan and China. They recognized the Republic of China as being the main government that ruled over both geographical spaces, Taiwan and mainland China. But in 1979, that switched, and Jimmy Carter and the United States stated that the government of the People's Republic of China was the sole legal government of China. Sole meaning that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, was and is the only China, with no consideration of the Republic of China as a separate sovereign entity. Now, Tillerson qualifies this and says the U.S. did not, however, give in to Chinese demands that it recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, which is the name preferred by the United States since it opted to de-recognize the Republic of China. Instead, Washington acknowledged the Chinese position that Taiwan was part of China. For geopolitical reasons, both the United States and the PRC were willing to go forward with diplomatic recognition, despite their differences on this matter. When China attempted to change the Chinese text from the original word acknowledge to recognize, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher told the Senate hearing questioner, quote, "We regard the English text as being the binding text. We regard the word acknowledge as being the word that is determinative for the U.S." In the August 17, 1982 U.S.-China communique, the United States went one step further, stating that it had no intention of using a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. Tillerson says, to this day, the U.S. one China position stands. The United States recognizes the PRC as the sole legal government of China, but only acknowledges the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China. So you can see they tried to put the linchpin of the U.S. policy on one word, and that one word is acknowledge versus recognize. Now, apparently that meant something to Christopher, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher. Now, I don't have the full text of what was said, in Congress or in the Senate regarding this joint communique and what the language is. But one thing I would argue is that acknowledge and recognize are synonyms. They're the same word. Now, I don't know if in the jargon, if in the legal speak, the diplomatic legal speak, if acknowledge and recognize traditionally hold two different definitions, where recognize is the word that is actually used when you talk about actual legal recognition of a country, of another country. But I think that the plain text of what the document is should rule over what the subjective beliefs of the parties were at the time when they signed it or when it was issued. Now, I think that that's kind of a core tenet of contract law, is that we don't look to what the intentions of the parties were per se. Now, I'm not a contract lawyer, but and maybe if there is a contract lawyer out there who's listening, who, or someone versed in international law who could tell me the difference. But from what I remember from law school, we don't look to the subjective beliefs of the parties of what they were entering into. We look to the objective clues, which first would be the actual text of the document, right? So, and here is the second question. What is the U.S. position on who has sovereignty over Taiwan? In the San Francisco Treaty of Peace of 1951, Japan renounced all right, title, and claim to Formosa and the Pescadores. Now, Formosa is like the formal term for Taiwan. Neither the Republic of China nor the People's Republic of China were parties to the treaty, and thus neither was declared a beneficiary of the Japanese renouncement. Well, President Richard Nixon's private notes show him willing to recognize the status of Taiwan as determined in part of China. Subsequent U.S. documents and statements show the United States as having no position on the Taiwan sovereignty question. Now, what he's referring to is the first joint communique, the Shanghai communique, that was issued by the Nixon regime in 1972. So the U.S. position regarding sovereignty over Taiwan remains steady and consistent with its one China policy. Both sides of the Taiwan Strait should mutually and peacefully agree to a resolution of this as yet unsettled issue. The United States doesn't agree with Beijing's claim to sovereignty over Taiwan, nor does it agree with Taipei that the ROC is an independent sovereign state. So we've talked about this a lot on the show, right? This idea of strategic ambiguity and dual deterrence. Right now, my argument is that strategic ambiguity is not the same thing as the one China policy. Strategic ambiguity, and people were saying this to me in Twitter arguments, is, well, strategic ambiguity is the official U.S. policy in regards to Taiwan and one China. I disagree, because I think that strategic ambiguity is specifically refers to the U.S. strategy of not saying what they would do in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That's what it is, right? You are doing, dual deterrence. You're telling Taiwan to tone it down with the independence rhetoric, and you're telling China, well, we might intervene if you invade Taiwan. And so you have an ambiguous position, strategic ambiguity. Now, I've written an entire article about this, talking about this really in detail, examining what the U.S. relationship is with strategic ambiguity. Because on the one hand, we say that we're not going to do anything, or that we don't have any the official policy is that, well, we don't have any pledges to defend Taiwan. We're not obligated to defend Taiwan, but we might do something. Then you get Biden pledging to defend Taiwan 4 times in his presidency, 4 times, saying that we would defend Taiwan and we have an obligation to do so. So I'm saying that, they want us to believe that we have strategic ambiguity. But if you actually look at what the facts are and what U.S. policy is, actions speak louder than words, right? The words are strategic ambiguity, but the actions are, no, we're really going to intervene. And so I put that in the show notes page for everyone to read if you haven't already. So, going back to the beginning, this is a handy little website here, Taiwan Documents Project. Here's the Shanghai communique. So, the 28th of February, 1972. Here's a picture of Kissinger, Nixon, and their Chinese leaders negotiating this. And I wanted to read a passage to kind of set the stage here. I'm not going to do this for every single joint communique, but this is Ted Carpenter's book, America's Coming War with China, which is funny because he wrote this a while ago. I think over 10 years ago. Just to look at the publication date. Why is it? Oh, 2005. So he wrote this a long time ago. And it's funny because he named it America's Coming War with China. So this is what he says. Now, this is also ignoring kind of the whole history of China and Taiwan, because during World War II, it was ruled by Japan. And that's what Tillerson was talking about in that interview. So he writes about the Shanghai Communique and the China policy in the 1970s. He says, as it took power, this is page 47, as it took power and to a certain degree before the Nixon administration pursued a different angle on China, one which would accumulate in trips to China by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and President Nixon. China policy was still a very touchy topic in the U.S. at the beginning of the 70s. The PRC had been demonized in the United States as maniacally ideological and inherently expansionist. Does that sound familiar? However, Nixon and Kissinger believed it would be to America's benefit to exploit China's fear of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's fear of China to increase America's room to maneuver on the global geopolitical stage. That's the exact opposite of our actual policy today. To that end, Kissinger secretly approached, through a series of back channels, the PRC to arrange for meetings. On July 1st, 1971, Kissinger flew to Pakistan, ostensibly on a tour of several Asian countries, and was smuggled into China to meet with PRC leaders and arrange a summit trip for Nixon. At the July 71 meetings, Taiwan was not a major subject of discussion. Indeed, specific issues that might be contentious were generally avoided, reflecting the paramount concern of both the Chinese and American governments to focus on countering the power of the Soviets. Kissinger's trip proved to be surprisingly successful, albeit short on details. In mid-July, Nixon announced that he would be visiting China the following year, quote, to seek normalization of relations between the two countries and also to exchange views on questions of concern to the two sides. Kissinger would visit China again, this time publicly in October 1971 to set the date for Nixon's trip, February 22nd, 1972. During Nixon's meetings with Mao Zedong in Beijing, it became increasingly clear that Taiwan was a problem issue. Yet in his memoirs, Kissinger wrote that, quote, neither then nor in any subsequent meeting did Mao indicate any impatience over Taiwan, set any time limits, make any threats, or treat it as the touchstone of our relationship. Nixon remembered it somewhat differently, though. Taiwan was the touchstone for both sides. Perhaps most interestingly, William Burr, a senior analyst with the National Security Archive, notes that at the 1972 meetings, quote, consistent with Beijing's wishes, the Americans agreed that Taiwan was not an, quote, international dispute between Americans and Chinese, but an internal matter for the Chinese to settle. The two parties issued the Shanghai Communique at the end of the February talks, laying a new foundation for U.S. policy toward the PRC. In that communique, the U.S. acknowledged that, quote, all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that China is maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The U.S. government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. With this prospect in mind, it affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal of all U.S. forces and military installations from Taiwan. In the meantime, it will progressively reduce its forces and military installations on Taiwan as the tension in the area diminishes. So furthermore, here's another paragraph. The two sides reviewed the long-standing serious disputes between China and the United States. The Chinese side reaffirmed its position. This is the Taiwan the One China principle. The Taiwan question is the crucial question obstructing the normalization of relations between China and the United States. The government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. This is the Chinese position. Taiwan is a province of China, which has long been returned to the motherland. The liberation of Taiwan is China's internal affair, in which no other country has the right to interfere. All U.S. forces and military installations must be withdrawn from Taiwan. The Chinese government firmly opposes any activities which aim at the creation of one China, one Taiwan. So the Chinese government firmly opposes the following: any activities which aim at the creation of one China, one Taiwan, or one China, two governments, two Chinas, an independent Taiwan, or advocate that, quote, the status of Taiwan remains to be determined. So the one China principle is that Taiwan is part of China, that China rules over Taiwan. And they oppose, any directions, any acts that would go into the direction of having Taiwan be independently sovereign. So this is the US side, and this is pretty important. The US side declared, the US acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The US government does not challenge that position. So if we're looking into exactly what the US government policy is, the US acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. So the US, if we're to believe the use of this word acknowledge, right? The word acknowledge means that I suppose I've heard people argue this, that acknowledge means, well, we don't agree with it, but we acknowledge that that's what the position is, right? But then it says the US government doesn't challenge that position. So if you acknowledge that someone has a position, yet you don't challenge it, isn't that a recognition? And again, I'll reiterate that these documents that I'm talking about in this episode today have mystified China experts for decades, probably ever since they were issued, maybe purposefully so, that it's impossible to determine exactly. I mean, it's clear that China views that Taiwan is part of China in that China has sovereignty over Taiwan. But at this point in time, it's like, okay, well, what does this mean? So the US acknowledges, it seems like they acknowledge that both the Taiwanese and the Chinese think that there's one China, that Taiwan isn't separate, that it's a package deal. The Taiwanese might believe that they are the rightful rulers over mainland China and vice versa. But the US government doesn't challenge that position, the position that there is but one China. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. With this prospect in mind, it affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal, yada, yada, yada. Reducing forces, pursuing peaceful relations. Each side agrees to, be nice. And so that's pretty much all that there is explicitly in terms of Taiwan in this document, in the first communique. So moving a little bit further on here in 1979, this is when, like, the Great Rapprochement, where the United States switches and doesn't recognize the ROC as being the sole government of the one China. Because again, in the first one, it says, the first joint communique in 1972, that the U.S. acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The U.S. government doesn't challenge that position, the one China position, that there is one China. But in 1979, and this is kind of the crux of my argument, the United States maintains that one China position, so believes and acknowledges that there is one China and that Taiwan is a part of China, and then recognizes that the PRC is the only legitimate government of that one China. So here it states, the US and the PRC have agreed to recognize each other and to establish diplomatic relations as of January 1st, 1979. The US government recognizes the government of the PRC as the sole legal government of China, Within this context, the people of the US will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. So you can see where I'm constructively building this case here, right? In the first joint communique in 1972, the US acknowledges that there is one China, that Taiwan is part of China, and doesn't challenge that position. So some people will say, the US acknowledged that the Chinese believe that Taiwan is part of China and that mainland China is part of Taiwan. But it also says the US government doesn't challenge that position. So in 72, maybe the position is, okay, well, there is one China. Taiwan is part of mainland China, but we believe that the ROC is ruling over both Taiwan and mainland. While in the second joint communique, we maintain that one China position, but switch our legal recognition to the PRC, the mainland government. So importantly, the second joint communique, the US and the PRC reaffirm the principles agreed upon by the two sides in the Shanghai communique, the first communique. So it's like they kind of do a thing that we do in the law sometimes, where in pleadings you will reincorporate or reallege something by reference. So it's almost as if they take the entire first joint communique and they copy paste it by reference just with this third paragraph here. But they emphasize once again that, both don't seek hegemony in the Asia Pacific, both wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. Now here, there's a lot of hay that's been made about this by people arguing against me. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. Both believe that normalization of the Sino-American relations is not only in the best interest of the Chinese and American peoples, but also contributes to the cause of peace in Asia and the world. So here, the government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Okay? Now, they don't say, we don't challenge that, but they incorporate by reference the first communique where they say they don't challenge that position. So in paragraph 3, they reaffirm everything stated in the first communique. And in paragraph 7, they acknowledge the Chinese position, again, that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Now, people say, again, they make hay with this word acknowledge and say that it doesn't mean we accept the argument, but we're acknowledging that the argument exists. While you're reincorporating by reference the first one where you say you don't challenge that position. So the US agrees and doesn't challenge that Taiwan is part of China. And then in the second communique, they say, well, there is one China. Taiwan is part of China. And the sole legitimate government of that one China is the PRC. Now, people will rightfully argue that, okay, it doesn't explicitly say that, but I'm saying that you can make the constructive case, as I believe the Chinese do. You could make a successful case just by logical deduction of what is agreed to in these documents. First, again, I'll reiterate because this is just so complicated and hard to wrap your head around, probably on purpose. Because remember, there's a huge Taiwan lobby in the United States, even during the 70s. And there were people in Congress who really disagreed with this. And of course, there were hawks back then, too. But this is, a tidal shift in U.S. policy after World War II in regard to Taiwan is occurring in 1979. And so, again, to reiterate, first, in the first communique in 72, the U.S. acknowledges the position that all Chinese everywhere believe that Taiwan is part of mainland China. So the Taiwanese believe that, the Chinese mainlanders believe that. The Taiwanese believe that they're the legitimate government of Taiwan and of China, and the Chinese mainlanders believe that The PRC is the legitimate government of both. But the US at least says it does not challenge the position, which basically, I don't know what else that would mean. That, okay, we see this, we don't agree with it, but we don't challenge it either. I mean, it's really, really splitting hairs here. It's kind of like pleading no contest to a criminal charge. It's like at the end of the day, you either plead guilty or no contest. Guilty means, yep, you got me, I did it, I agree with everything alleged in the complaint. If you plead no contest, you say, well, I don't agree with everything in the complaint, but I believe that there's enough there, if proven, will convict me. Well, at the end of the day, the judge is just going to accept your plea and find you guilty anyways. So it's like, okay, well, we acknowledge your position that there's one China and we don't challenge it. Isn't that an acceptance or a recognition? And furthermore, they reaffirm the challenge, but then incorporate by reference the first one saying that, we don't challenge it. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. So moving forward, the 6 assurances, before the 6 assurances came out after, in tandem with the 1982 Third Joint Communique, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, which I've also talked about, believe I talked about in my piece. So what happens, and I think this is evidence, the very fact that this was passed is evidence, and it was introduced just a month or two after the Second Joint Communique. The fact that this was passed is evidence that the First and Second Joint Communiques established the U.S. position that there's one China and Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC rules over Taiwan. because it really pissed off the Taiwan lobby when the second joint communique was passed and diplomatic recognition shifted. So the Congress passes the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically establishes a foreign, I mean, not in name, but it establishes like a foreign diplomatic office in Taiwan that is a de facto embassy. So this is what Ted Carpenter has to say about it. On December 15th, 1978, the Carter administration abruptly announced that on January 1st, 1979, the U.S. would shift diplomatic recognition from the Republic of China to the PRC. In the second communique with the PRC, the United States also again, quote, acknowledged the Chinese position that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. Simultaneously, the U.S. provided Taiwan with 1 year's notice that it intended to abrogate the Mutual Defense Treaty in accordance with the Mutual Defense Treaty's provisions. So there was a Mutual Defense Treaty in place. The negotiations surrounding the second communique were shrouded in secrecy, so much so that Taiwanese President Chiang Ching-kuo was awakened in the middle of the night to hear the news of Carter's announcement. Panic and recriminations took root among the Taiwanese. Angry mobs in Taiwan stomped peanuts in effigy of President Carter, and the ROC embassy in Washington hastily destroyed documents and shifted assets to avoid legal troubles. The Carter administration had conducted the negotiations for the shift of recognition under a veil of secrecy to prevent Taiwan's advocates in Congress from mounting a campaign against derecognition of Taiwan. Accordingly, the announcement came as a surprise to most Taiwan partisans in Congress and elsewhere. Then former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, gave a speech at Pepperdine University in which he asked rhetorically but pointedly, quote, "Have we become unreliable and capricious? Are we so lacking in common decency and morality, so motivated by the dictates of the moment, that we can, by the stroke of a pen, put 17 million people over the side and escape the consequences?" The Taiwan lobby in Congress claimed that the Carter administration had circumvented proper congressional oversight of the canceling of treaties. Senator Barry Goldwater, Republican Arizona, was particularly incensed and mounted a challenge on constitutional grounds, alleging that the president did not have constitutional authority to abrogate the provisions of the Mutual Defense Treaty without consulting with Congress. Goldwater, who had mounted a similar unsuccessful case to stop President Nixon's bombing of Cambodia, warned that the precedent that would be set by allowing Carter to abrogate the Mutual Defense Treaty without congressional consent would mean, quote, heading down the road to a dictatorship. Although the federal district court originally found in Goldwater's favor, that ruling was overturned on appeal and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Carter's policy would stand. At the same time, the U.S. shifted diplomatic recognition, however, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. President Carter, concluding that pro-Taiwan forces in Congress had enough votes to override a veto, reluctantly decided to sign the bill. The TRA became law in April 1979. Among other provisions, the TRA, quote, pledged that the United States will maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people on Taiwan. So I don't think that this part necessarily goes against the joint communiques because there were pledges that, well, actually, I think it kind of does, because in the joint communique, it says that, of course, both sides pledge that they won't resort to force or anything like that. But the United States also says that the solving of this is an internal Chinese matter. So now maybe, of course, they both pledge to solve the issue peacefully. But it says the liberation of Taiwan is China's internal affair in which no other country has a right to interfere. Well, that's what the Chinese say. Internal. No, it's not in there. So maybe that isn't part of the language, is that it's an internal matter. But both sides do pledge to peacefully, come up with a peaceful agreement here. But this is the beginning of the strategic ambiguity question and why I differentiated between the two. Strategic ambiguity specifically refers to what the U.S. would do in the event of a violent Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And this is part of what kind of assuages those forces in Congress that are pro-Taiwan. It also, the TRA promised to, quote, make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. It also stated that regardless of the withdrawal of diplomatic recognition, quote, the laws of the U.S. shall apply with respect to Taiwan in the manner that the laws of the U.S. applied with respect to Taiwan prior to January 1st, 1979. And it also established the American Institute in Taiwan, which would function as a de facto embassy. So this is what Ted Carpenter says about the language of, like, the legacy of the two communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. He says, as with the two communiques and the one that would follow, the language of the TRA was torturous and legalistic. It has confounded both American analysts and PRC officials ever since its inception. And now it's confounding you and me. So you're welcome. For example, some American analysts, such as Peter Brooks of the Heritage Foundation, a hawkish think tank, have held that the TRA represents a continuation of the security guarantee under the Mutual Defense Treaty that the Carter administration had jettisoned as part of the deal for the second communique. In fact, this analysis is almost certainly wrong, says Ted Carpenter. Representative Ken Kramer had attempted to introduce an amendment to the TRA in the House that would have inserted the portion of the Mutual Defense Treaty that claimed that an attack on Taiwan was in violation of U.S. interests and that the U.S. would respond to threats to its interests. So there's a pretty convincing argument by Ted Carpenter basically saying, no, the TRA is not a mutual defense guarantee. It's nothing that's in the TRA that is a defense guarantee. It just says that the U.S. will maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security of the social or economic system of the people on Taiwan. So they would maintain the capacity. It's not a defense guarantee. And he says that there was a vetoed amendment proposed to the TRA that would have been explicit, and it was explicitly vetoed. Others such as, it wasn't vetoed, it was rejected by a vote. Others, such as Taiwan expert Richard Bush, have countered that the passage in the TRA relating to Taiwan security describes, quote, capabilities only and not intentions. Moreover, the TRA merely asserts that, quote, efforts to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means, including by boycotts or embargoes, would be a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific area and of grave concern to the U.S. It further directs the chief executive to inform the Congress promptly of any threat to the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan and any danger to the interests of the United States arising therefrom. The President and the Congress shall determine, in accordance with constitutional processes, appropriate action by the U.S. in response to any such danger. To read such statements as a defense commitment is an ambitious stretch, says Ted Carpenter. The U.S. frequently expresses grave concern over international crises, such as escalations of the Arab-Israeli conflict, nuclear proliferation, and countless others. Few believe that grave concern in those cases is a U.S. commitment to intervene militarily. So, Beijing, however, feared, he continues, Ted Carpenter, Beijing, however, feared that the TRA was indeed an extension of the old Mutual Defense Treaty. If the U.S. saw the TRA as a pledge to defend Taiwan, then in the PRC's eyes, Beijing's efforts in negotiating the second communique had been for naught. PRC Foreign Minister Huang Hua retorted on March 16, 1979, during the negotiations in Congress over the TRA, that, quote, if the bills are passed as they are worded now and are signed into law, great harm will be done to the new relationship that has just been established between China and the U.S. The bills were signed into law, however, after passing by a 339-50 margin in the House and an 85-4 margin in the Senate. The PRC's continued fear and threats regarding the TRA were assuaged by President Carter's assurances that the U.S. would continue to conduct its policy in accordance with both the 1972 and 1978 communiques, The PRC also recognized that it desperately needed to cultivate relations with the U.S. as a counterweight to the Soviet Union and capitalize on the economic potential inherent in closer Sino-U.S. Ties. Consequently, Beijing soon muted its protests. So essentially, I mean, the TRA does not affect the Shanghai Communique, although the Shanghai Communique, the first and second joint communiques, although I think it does, in a way, it does run counter to the spirit of the two documents, but there's nothing that explicitly violates promises and assurances made in the first communiques. So now there's a third joint communique, the joint communique on arms sales to Taiwan. Of course, arms sales to Taiwan has been a huge issue ever since the second joint communique was passed. Mostly, and I think the Taiwan Relations Act also pledges that basically the U.S. won't sell more weapons to Taiwan than it does to China. Now, I think that has since been turned on its head, but at least that's what it was at the time. So here's a nice little summation for you. In the joint communique, this is the third joint communique, 1982. In the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations, the second joint communique on January 1st, 1979, issued by the government of the U.S. and the PRC, the U.S. recognized the government of the PRC as the sole legal government of China, and it acknowledged the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Within that context, the two sides agreed that the people of the U.S. would continue to maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. On this basis, relations between the U.S. and China were normalized. Okay, there's that use of the term acknowledged. I just want to point that out. Acknowledged the position that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. Now, I don't think that this is an actual restatement of exactly what the first joint communique said. Because again, that first joint communique said, essentially, we don't challenge that position. The U.S. government does not challenge that position. But again here, in paragraph 3 of the third joint communique in 1982, it says, respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference in each other's international affairs constitute the fundamental principles guiding the U.S.-China relations. These principles were confirmed in the first joint communique and reaffirmed in the second joint communique. Both sides emphatically state that these principles continue to govern all aspects of their relations. Now here it really seems like it's another incorporation by reference of the first two joint communiques, which I would argue would make, this statement, the U.S. government does not challenge that position, as being the trump card. Now, I think this is important, too, in determining exactly what the U.S. government's official policy is. Here's paragraph 5 of the third joint communique. The U.S. government attaches great importance to its relations with China and reiterates it has no intention of infringing on Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity or interfering in China's internal affairs. Here's the kicker, or pursuing a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. The United States government understands and appreciates the Chinese policy of striving for a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan question, as indicated in China's message to compatriots in Taiwan issued on January 1st, 1979, and other proposals that it made. And so it says, funny, the U.S. government states it does not seek to carry out a long-term policy of arms sales to Taiwan, that its arms sales to Taiwan will not exceed, either in qualitative or in quantitative terms, the level of those supplied in recent years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China, and that it intends gradually to reduce its sale of arms to Taiwan, leading over a period of time to a final resolution. Funny, because we've completely thrown that out the window in the last couple of years, as I've covered on this show. In so stating, the U.S. acknowledges China's consistent position regarding the thorough settlement of this issue. And again, here, paragraph 8, The two governments reaffirmed the principles agreed on by the two sides in the Shanghai Communique and the Joint Communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations. Basically, again, I think arguably an incorporation by reference of the principles, of the promises and assurances made in the first Joint Communique. So now here are the 6 assurances to Taiwan that came out in tandem. July 1982. So actually before the third Joint Communique. But here are 6 quick assurances. So here's the background on it. It says in 1982, during negotiations for the third Joint Communique on arms sales to Taiwan, the Taiwan government presented to the United States 6 points that it proposed the U.S. use as guidelines in conducting U.S.-Taiwan relations. According to former Ambassador John Holdridge, the U.S. agreed to these points, conveyed this assent to Taiwan, and in late July 1982 informed the Congress of the agreement. So, again, these are from Taiwan to the U.S., and then the U.S. agrees with them and presents it to Congress. So 1, the U.S. would not set a date for termination of arms sales to Taiwan. The U.S. would not alter the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act. The U.S. would not consult with China in advance before making decisions about U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. The U.S. would not mediate between Taiwan and China. The U.S. would not alter, number 5, the U.S. would not alter its position about the sovereignty of Taiwan, which was that the question was to be decided peacefully by the Chinese themselves and would not pressure Taiwan to enter into negotiations with China. And 6, the U.S. would not formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. Now, again, I think it's important that these are assurances that Taiwan first presented to the United States. Now, the former ambassador, John Holdridge, agreed to these points. Now, I don't know what the legality is of the U.S. ambassador to Taiwan, who's not really an official, at this point in time, is not an official ambassador. It would seem like you would have, I don't know, like the U.S. ambassador to the UK or something like that. Because again, remember, the United States at this point in time is not supposed to have any official relations with Taiwan. But you have Ambassador John Holdridge agreeing to these points and then informing Congress of it. And I think, based on what I've said before, that number 6 is out the window. The U.S. would not formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, because I think they did de facto in the first joint communique, with the logical implications arising from it that I've already explained earlier in this episode, right? You say, well, there is but one China. Taiwan is part of that China. We don't challenge that position. We acknowledge the position that people have that Taiwan is part of China and China is part of Taiwan. We don't challenge that position. There is one China. And we're going to go ahead and recognize that the PRC is the sole legitimate government, the sole legal government of China. So again, there's one China. The United States acknowledges the position that Taiwan believes mainland China is part of Taiwan, and mainland China believes that Taiwan is part of China. Well, we acknowledge that both sides have that position, and we don't challenge it. Oh yeah, and by the way, 7 years later, we're going to officially recognize that the PRC is the sole legitimate government of China, that we said before includes Taiwan. So I don't know. I think that's a pretty solid logical case to make. Even if you accept the difference between the use of the term acknowledge and recognize. Now, again, the 6 assurances were something that Taiwan presented to the unofficial U.S. ambassador to Taiwan, John Holdridge. I don't know exactly what the details are on that. Maybe he was the ambassador to Taiwan before 1979, and now he's just the unofficial ambassador to Taiwan, because we can't say he's official, because officially we don't recognize that Taiwan can engage in diplomacy. But we're going to, according to the joint communiques or the Taiwan Relations Act, we're going to maintain unofficial relations, diplomatic or cultural relations with the people of Taiwan. So all that to say, I hope that you guys have a better understanding now of, I hope you're not more confused than you were when you started this episode, because I really think, as things heat up with China and the US over Taiwan, this is it's a confusing, sometimes frankly kind of, I think it's interesting, but maybe a lot of people think it's boring. But it's a very complicated and complex and kind of convoluted history. But Taiwan, since the beginning, really has been the linchpin of US-China relations, and it's not really surprising that it still is now. And so to have an understanding of exactly how US policy came to be, or what the actual diplomatic history of it is in terms of what was written down and what promises and guarantees were made to the letter, not what other people say about them or what other people's impression of it is, or not even what people in Congress thought about it at the time. What does the actual words say? Now, we're going to take a look at the definition of acknowledge. Now, you can cite actual, dictionary entries in legal documents. So acknowledge is a verb meaning to recognize the rights, authority, or status of. So I don't know. We acknowledge that position. Okay, so we acknowledge the authority, rights, or status, or recognize. I mean, it's literally right there, to recognize the rights, authority, or status of. To disclose knowledge of or agreement with. So if the accepted definition of acknowledge is to disclose your agreement with something, then the U.S. acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is part of China, is a part of China. By the Merriam-Webster, maybe we could even look at a different one. Which dictionary should we use? Maybe let's use the Black's Law Dictionary. Here's Black's Law Dictionary. The action of confessing or to admit something. Acknowledge. Definition and legal meaning. So I don't know. That's really short. The action of confessing or to admit something. That's even more damning. And this is Black's Law Dictionary. We're admitting, the U.S. admits that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. And 7 years later, we're going to acknowledge that the Chinese PRC is the sole government of China. Let's see. Stating that something is true or factual. Acknowledgement, according to Black's Law Dictionary. Stating that something is true or factual when a buyer agrees to pay for their purchase, a message that... So, actually, I don't know. So, something is true or factual. So, in that use of the word, you could say, okay, well, maybe it's not the definition of the word acknowledge. It's that it says the U.S. acknowledges that all Chinese believe that there's but one China. But then it says the U.S. government does not challenge that position. So, yeah, you really, I think it's not a straightforward thing to say, to just like Rex Tillerson does. It's not a straightforward close the book type of thing to say, well, acknowledge only referred to agreeing, yeah, the Chinese believe this, but we don't agree with it. It says here the US doesn't challenge that position. So anyways, I'm not going to beat the horse to death, but basically, again, to disclose knowledge of or agreement with. So maybe you just say, yeah, we know that all Chinese believe that there's one China and Taiwan is part of that China. Anyways. So now, I mean, you can really like see how, I don't know, particular this all is, and just kind of stare slack-jawed at it. Now, I think going back over my tweet, I think this is right to say, based off the first joint communique. Now, to go in, I do think it is incorrect to say that the U.S. official policy is that Taiwan is part of China and that China has sovereignty over Taiwan. Now, you can make the case based on the documents, but I think the real most correct answer is that it's unclear exactly what the U.S. position is. Now, in hindsight, U.S. officials try to say basically, yeah, I mean, now we definitely don't agree that Taiwan is part of China and that China has sovereignty over Taiwan. That's a big no-no thing to say. But essentially, I don't know what else the implication is from these documents, from the actual documents, the promises that were made. So, okay, well, I think I've said enough about this. If you want to go and read some of my other pieces I've written on Taiwan at the Libertarian Institute, After Ukraine Is Taiwan Next? I had a bit more of a simpler understanding of this issue at that point in time. But Washington is gaslighting us about Taiwan, I think is a good piece talking about Nancy Pelosi's visit. I think it's worth reading. So when it's all said and done, I don't think it really matters what the actual U.S. policy is in regard to Taiwan, right? It's a big quagmire, and it's that way on purpose. I think you could, like I said in this episode, you could make a good case that the official U.S. policy, going through the documents and what's actually written down, is that there is one China and there's one soul, and Taiwan is part of that one China, and the only legitimate government over that one China is the PRC. You can make a good case of that. But just like the myth of the rule of law, you can also make a good case for the opposite. I think it fails in the end, but you can make a good case for that. The best answer really is, I mean, objectively speaking, that the U.S. policy is unclear on that front. And that's not very satisfying. But you don't need to get the brownie points that I was seeking for, basically the slam dunk clout on all these people outraged about what the LP Georgia tweeted when they said Taiwan is part of China. Or I don't know exactly what they had said, but they said something like that. And they were citing me actually in tweets. You don't have to say that to argue quite convincingly and correctly that the United States shouldn't be involved and that it's an internal question for the Chinese to decide themselves, and that we shouldn't be selling weapons. We shouldn't be getting involved in these internal affairs, and we shouldn't, I mean, there's a whole nother episode we could do on whether or not strategic ambiguity is something that's worth pursuing, whether or not it has maintained peace, whether or not the United States should be doing things like having an ambiguous stance on a defense guarantee. That's a conversation for another day. As a libertarian, I don't think we should be involved at all on principle, but I also recognize that, these diplomatic conventions are in place and have been in place, and, simply reneging on arms sales to Taiwan completely and cutting it off cold turkey might cause tumult. But on the flip side, what continuing this crazy path of, flooding Taiwan with weapons and recognizing unofficially taking actions that support the idea of Taiwanese sovereignty, sending delegations to the island, training their forces covertly, deploying U.S. soldiers to Taiwan. That's not something we should be doing, and it doesn't deter China. It actually makes conflict more likely, and we can see that in how China's responded and what they're saying, because they say it pretty openly that, U.S. recognitions of of Taiwanese sovereignty and weapon sales and things like that actually make conflict more likely. So again, I wanted to get to the bottom of this because I think my position is defendable that I made on Twitter, but you don't have to be right about that position or even defend that position to correctly argue that the United States needs to change its policy on the situation. So anyways, I hope you all have a better understanding of this whole issue now, and just appreciate you guys listening. Yeah, so head on over to Libertarian Institute where my work is featured. libertarianinstitute.org/donate is how you can help us out there. It's also tax deductible, so write it off on your taxes because we're a nonprofit. And vitaldescent.com. So we'll catch you later. Peace.